For those of you who were not dancing in the Imperial Hotel, you may stay seated. Others, please leave. All right. I have the honor of this panel, and I'm going to give my panel the honor of not introducing them, not because I don't think they're highly credentialed in all their own ways, but to honor them by giving them time to speak, which is what I think they're here to do. So I think that would be the best way forward at this point, because you've all read their bios in the program brochure, and you can see them, you may have seen them on the screen. I hope that's not offensive to any of the panelists, but I think that's the more important information that we want to talk about and ideas that they've been working on. Can everybody hear me in the room? Okay, terrific. So we are going to have this panel. The first speaker is Omme-Salma Rahemtullah, and then we'll have Alyshea Cummins and Salima Versi. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Omme-Salma. Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zulfikar. And we have 15 minutes or 15 now?
We have someone there who will be directing traffic, so she will.
Is it 15 minutes? Okay, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. So my name is Omme-Salma Rahemtullah, and I am here as a, what is it called, independent researcher. I used to be in academia a while ago, but left. But I recently was a fellow, a research archival fellow at the South Asian American Digital Archive. And what that is, it's an American archive. I now live in South Carolina. I'm from Toronto. Born in Dar es Salaam, same story as most of us here. But this being a kind of a hybrid conference, I've been to academic conferences, definitely not what this is, and that's really great, and that's the reason that I wanted to come here, is because I've been working on a community archive. So I just want to take a minute to talk about SADA. The South Asian American Digital Archive is a post-custodial archive. It's all online. Post-custodial meaning that they don't keep the materials, scan it nicely, take pictures, keep the recordings online. And it's really kind of in this area of community archiving, where community members are archiving their own stories. And after, I think, 5 years of being in existence, they created a what is it called? Archival Creators Fellowship, which, as you probably know, in the United States as well as in Canada, I think, 15, 20 years ago, the stories of South Asian history were really India and Hindu-centric, right, upper caste. So it was a fellowship, gave resources to community members to archive the stories of their communities from underrepresented South Asian communities. Not marginalized, I would say. I think we as a community, and by that I mean East African, Indian, Ismailis, non-Ismailis, have a certain level of privilege in the States and in the places in which we live, but definitely underrepresented in the history of South Asians in North America. So during that fellowship, I interviewed 9 Ugandan Asians who settled in South Carolina. And I think it's can you move to the next slide? Sorry. I don't know how one does that. Is it that? Okay. This is part of my fellowship, so if you're interested in finding out more, I wrote 3 articles, which I'll talk about in a bit, and then there's the archive itself, of the oral histories, and then I was just telling Salima, right? Mm-hmm. That I did a online cooking show called Kachi Kitchen. It's really fun. I made bhajiyas, my mom made mandazi, and then one of the people that I interviewed made tarelo mogo. It was fun. It was like, and like Zainab was talking about, of course, these stories come through food. Like, food is a very important archive of, I don't know what I'm doing. Do I push this? Okay. So this is South Carolina in the context of the States. So you can kind of see Toronto up there by the lakes, and South Carolina is like 13-hour drive south from Toronto. But, we've been talking a lot about the settlement in the UK and in Canada, obviously, but a very small portion of Ugandan Asians were paroled into the United States. And that is, so they weren't technically refugees, because at that time in 1972 in the US, refugees could only be coming from the Middle East or North Africa, or of course escaping communism, which Ugandans did not fit. And these were the stateless Ugandans that we've talked about who could not get into Canada because, as we talked about also, Canada had the point system, right? So most of the people that I interviewed for this project had a few members of their extended family or immediate family that did not speak English. And that was the primary reason for which they weren't able to get refugee status in Canada. And so very, very limited, 1,500 were paroled. First it was 1,000, then it was increased to 1,500, were paroled into the US. And 500 got settled in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which I don't know how to explain to you, but the northern part of South Carolina is what one would refer to as the Bible Belt now. Trump land, it's Trump land now, right? So it's really, now, in 2022 to think, oh my God, why were they up there? It was a really important textile industry town at the time. And these Ugandan refugees or parolees were skilled, and the ones that were working did speak English. So they were very attractive to the upstate. And the business chamber in Spartanburg supported their arrival. Also, it was the first Ismaili Jamaat Khana in the US. So that was in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and it's still there. Not in the same building, of course, but it was these Ugandan Asians who established, I guess, the Ismaili community, in the South at least, but definitely the first institutionalized Jamaat Khana. And that's the kind I go to. So when I moved to the States 5 years ago from Toronto to South Carolina, I discovered that there were these Ugandans, and I was like, what? I had no idea anyone came to the States, and so that's where this project started. I started collecting their oral histories, I was just interested, I wasn't working at the time, I had time on my hand, and so, and then this fellowship at SADA came up, and it really fit well into that, and I got accepted to this program. So that's just the background. This is really a community project. It comes from the community archiving perspective, so I'm not giving an academic paper, but just sharing some of my insights about what the settlement in the U.S. looks like and how it, not how it's different in a bad or pejorative way, but just what the settlement looked like and, in the U.S., that we don't see in the U.K. or Canada, right? So a bit more context about South Carolina, it's up there on the map. I cannot state enough how important, and not in a positive way, right, that South Carolina was to the slave trade. 40% of slaves were brought to the Charleston Harbor, which is in the south part of the state, and it was one of the biggest slave markets for U.S.-born slaves. So it is a black place, right? It is a African-American place. The population right now is around 35 to 40% black. And a lot of cities, including Spartanburg, which a lot of these Ugandan Asians went to, were 50-50 cities. So what that means is 50 black, 50 white. There's a lot of majority black cities in South Carolina, but I think the 50-50 is an important place to be settled for people that are coming from Africa, right? And just a bit more on South Carolina, it is the traditional territories of the East Cherokee and the Congaree and Catawba. Catawba is the only federally recognized tribe, indigenous tribe in South Carolina. So there's three, I guess, observations about the United States and the Ugandan Asian settlement that I would like to share. One is around race, and what is it that South Asians coming from Africa and living in a black community, what is that, what around anti-blackness, what around racism, what about perception does that show us? The second is the parolee status. Not being a refugee really was difficult for folks in terms of a pathway to citizenship. The only way that they could even have a pathway to citizenship was through an executive order. And that's a long history as well. But also, as I had mentioned, I think food. Food is super important to me. And especially, like a quick anecdote is that black-eyed peas, like when we make chora jabajia, In the South, the tradition is to start your New Year's Day with black-eyed peas, and it's usually with a dish called Hoppin' John, which is rice and black-eyed peas. So me and my husband, you know, our first New Year's together, my first New Year's in South Carolina, we made bhajia. I was like, you know, so it's like this kind of fusion. It's cute. So that was really important. The food is like, if you've ever had grits, very similar to ugali. There's obviously, needless to say, very important foodways between Africa and South Carolina. But what I wanted to touch on in the rest of my presentation is around race and talking about anti-Blackness, and I'm really glad that we're not afraid of that word here in this conference, but thinking about anti-Blackness in relation to the American South. And it's really hard to parse now as well with a really large Indian American population. So those are kind of, you know, leaving more questions and thoughts, but, you know, what I was thinking about throughout this project. So how do I play these clips? Nope. Is there a way to do that? Can someone play the second clip? So this is a clip from one of my interviewees when I asked them about, like, what is their racial identity? You can really hear that is informed by being in the South.
Can I ask if there's someone? Oh.
Your schoolmates had never seen a brown person before. Was it?
No, not in 1974. They did not. And also, I learned much later that America had just integrated the schools in 1972 or 73. So it's like the first or second year of integration where black and white kids went to school together. So even then, it was and I didn't know all that. You know, I had no clue. But yeah, so it was a whole different, you know, everything's different. It was no turmoil or anything. I mean, you know, none of that, but it's just different. Yeah.
And the students in your school were black and white?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's integrated.
Yeah. And
I used to ride the school bus, and yeah.
And even the black kids were kind of fascinated by your brownness?
Yeah. Yeah, because they hadn't seen brown people before. They did not have brown people here. And I didn't know that at that time, but I look back now and I realize that's what it was. But yeah.
And what was, I mean, if you remember this or if not, but what were the students, especially the black students, kind of perception of you being from Africa? You know, because Africa is a black space.
There was no perception. You know, adults and politicians put perceptions in people's heads, and so then they screw people up. But people in their natural state don't think like that. They do now because they're all screwed up. But yeah.
So no,
it wasn't any of that.
because I remember clearly for myself in the 7th grade. When I told people I was from Africa, they're like, "You can't be from Africa. You're black. I mean, you're not black."
No, I didn't get. If I did, I don't remember that. But I know they were fascinated with all my war stories and Idi Amin, and I mean, it was a lot more fresh back then, you know. But yeah, and I didn't make stuff up. I mean, whatever I told them is accurate. I don't remember what I told them. But,
Right.
Yeah. No, that I didn't see. Well, of course, now today, and I tell the people that that I'm the real African American, you know, because I was born in Africa. You know, all the black people here are just wannabes. I'm the real deal. So they all look at me and then they smile because it's true.
Yeah, I mean.
So that's how I look at it.
Is that how you feel? Do you feel African American? Like, what is if someone asks
No,
you what you're
I'm a 100% American. I don't feel African American. I have no loyalty to Africa.
And no kind of like identity as Indian?
No, I'm an American.
Okay, so you don't find any kind of identity.
This is my home. This is my home, and I defended it, and I will still defend it.
Right, because you were in the military.
You see, I'm talking the talk and walking the walk. Yeah.
I mean, needless to say, he was a character, but he migrated. I mean, I think I should have prefaced by saying that he was young when he came. I think he was he was 9 when he came to South Carolina. And you know, the second clip I want to play is from an adult. So I think the difference between someone who settled as an adult, and I think the difference between the times that we settled, like there's an innocence of youth, right? There's like, we didn't see color. Even the other clip was like, there was no color, there was no difference. But at the same time, I think it's really playing into the settler colonial project of erasing our histories, right? African Americans are not real Africans. He's not Indian. Like that kind of history, the melting pot of the States, the melting pot of Canada, you know, allows us to kind of erase those roots, and also kind of the colonial histories that come with that. And I think, I neglected to say another part of this project that I'm doing is thinking about what it is to be a refugee, a parolee, on Indigenous land, right? So these two come together in the States, especially in the South, right? This is a settler colonial state, a settler colonial project built on stolen land with stolen people, right? Those are part, especially in the South, part of the same settler colonial project. So I really see this as, in one way, kind of this innocence of youth as another way of just erasing all of our histories, right? In the end, he serves in the military, again, a settler colonial project, the military industrial complex, let me tell you, he really believes in that. That's the way that I guess I see race playing into that. So I just want to play you the next clip. Can I advance to the next slide?
Moved to Spartanburg.
No, not this one, sorry. In the next slide. Yeah, that one. So this is from the person who moved as an adult. Oh, if you haven't started, if I might. I neglected to say, which I think is one of the most important parts of this being a community project, is that I did all the interviews in Kutchi. I'm sorry, I should have said that before. I gave people the choice, the elder people, all the elder women decided to do the interview with me in Kutchi, and the elder men kind of refused to speak Kutchi, which is obviously, we talked about culture and gender and all that fun stuff. And of course, the younger folks who moved here, younger, I say like my age, right? We spoke in English. So this is a dubbed version of that interview. If you want to hear the full one, you can, if you want to listen to my terrible Kutchi, you can go to the archive online. Okay, thank you. You can play it.
That I didn't want to come to America because there was too many black people here. That's why I didn't want to settle in America, because when they were bringing the slaves here, the boat came to Charleston. The boat was coming to Charleston. The slaves were coming to Charleston. So that's why in the South, South Carolina, there's a lot of blacks. There's more blacks because the port was just here in Charleston. So when we were learning history in school, I told Nizar that I didn't want to go to New York or America. I don't want to go because I left a black country and I don't want to go to another black country. So then that's why I wanted to go to England. I wanted to go to England more. But then Nizar said, no, I'm not going to come. So how was I going to live in England by myself with a daughter? So then I decided if he's going to stay in the States, then I'll come to the States.
I think that clip is self-explanatory, right? There's like this really kind of ingrained anti-blackness that comes from us being from East Africa, right? And that's what I was saying, that there's, a difficulty in some ways to parse it out between, plain old Indian American anti-black racism, but there is this background of being from a black country and understanding or seeing the proximity to blackness and not wanting to be part of it in this new life. I think I'll end there. I think the questions are maybe obvious that I wanted to pose. Thank you.
Thank you. Terrific. The next person is Alyshea.
Can you just pass the clicker?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
So I'll just wait for my presentation to come up. My presentation is the long title. It's entitled, What's Happening to the Faith of Our Forefathers? Religious Transmission in East African Ismaili Muslim Families in Canada. And it's a purple deck, if that helps. But I will start off by saying, so my name is Alyshea Cummins. I completed my postdoctoral fellowship, that's it right there, yes, at the University of Ottawa. The greater project was entitled The Transmission of Religion Across Generations, and it was a multi-country research project in Germany, Hungary, Italy, Finland, and in Canada. And it was two-part. There was a qualitative research component, so interviews, and then there was also a quantitative research component that did a survey. So I will talk a little bit about both findings. I'm just going to read my research questions while the presentation comes up. But my research, oh, there we are. Thank you. Click this, I think. No, am I clicking the wrong button?
There it goes.
Oh, awesome. Okay. So my research questions that I I aspired to answer in this 15-minute presentation are: what role does migration and resettlement play in religious continuity in East African Ismaili Muslim families? What other factors impact religious continuity across generations? And what contributors seem to be most important in preserving religion across generations? Because of the time limitation, I am going to be focusing mainly on the third question, looking at what seems to be most impactful in preserving religion across generations. But I'm going to try and throw in answers to some of those, the two former questions. And of course, during the question and answer period, if anyone has any more questions, they can certainly ask. So those were just the two projects that, or I'll just go back. So I'm just going to paint the context briefly. My doctoral dissertation looked at Ismaili identity and participation in Canada. And so it was entitled Alleviating the Clash of Ignorance in Ismaili Muslim Initiative. And it looked not only at, it looked at how two different contexts impact Ismaili identity. The context of Islamophobia and how Islamophobia shapes Ismaili identity, and also the context of takfirism, so the labeling of another Muslim as an apostate, how that impacts Ismaili Muslim identity as well. From the survey, I'm looking mainly at what was happening to religion across generations. So I reran some survey data just to kind of look at some of the trends. And while I'm not going to show those that data in this presentation today for time, I will say that you do see that the faith is slightly declining across generations, not to a large extent, but you do see that religion is not only declining but maybe also transforming across generations, and I believe that has a lot to do with the context, the change in context. So from Homeland to the Canadian context, how context is very much important in shaping religious expression and form. Okay, and then the other one, this is the major research project, and it's important to note that for what we did was we interviewed 3-generation families for the most part, but when we couldn't get 3-generation families to participate in the interview to look at how religion transforms or changes across generations, we did do 2-generation families. So there were 16 families interviewed in total, around 58 participants in total, and the religious affiliations varied. They were Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelical, non-denominational Christianity, and then with Islam mainly being Ismailism or exclusive Ismailism, and non-religious. And then for the portion of this project, just so that you know, I've isolated the Ismaili Muslim families. There were 10 participants in total from either Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, or a combination of those. And there was only one family with 3 generations present. The others were of 2 generations. And of course, we talked about some push factors that led to the migration here, independence movements and Africanization projects. All these families came between 1972 and 1979, so they were part of the second wave of Canadian migration. Did I want to say something else here? No, I'll just keep going to kind of get some of the meat of the matter. So some general project findings from the postdoctoral research project. Oh, I did want to speak a little bit about methodology, just slightly. So when I did this analysis for this particular presentation and paper, I wanted to look at all the families that we interviewed, so those 16 families, where religious transmission was successful. So I wanted to see what factors impacted successful transmission. And then those who were of immigrant background, if immigration or migrant identity played an impact in religious transmission, and then what factors seem to impede religious transmission. So when I wrote this paper, I'm not finished yet, but the draft of this paper, I looked at all these families to kind of see, to tease out why, the most important factors in the continuity of religion across generations. So some of the survey findings, immigrant religions are more effective at transmitting religion, but we obviously can't find out why that is, and this is why qualitative research is important. Another finding was that religious transmission was more successful if a mother measures high on religious intensity. Now, religious intensity is often, religious affiliation and religious practice kind of lumped together. This is how traditionally studies have measured religious intensity. So we may also be measuring, religion wrong. In this sense, especially when we think about, like second generation, third generation immigrants and their religious identity, maybe we need to think more about different aspects of religious form and religious expression when we think about religious intensity. But again, traditionally, it's how often do you go to church? How often do you pray? Those kinds of things are how we traditionally measure religious intensity. And another really interesting finding is that discussing religion, mainly with the mother, increases the chances of one being religious. And I'll talk a little bit about why that becomes important. And another, more generally speaking, one of the main findings we found from the interviews is that it is becoming increasingly difficult to transmit religion in Canadian secular society. So context really matters. It was easier to transmit religion in Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, than it is to transmit religion in Canada. And there are many reasons for this. One being, for the Ismaili communities in particular, it was convenient to go to Jamaat Khana, so their center of worship, every single day because it was minutes away from where they lived. And in the Canadian context, it is most often than not inconvenient to attend Jamaat Khana daily, if not even weekly. But our first generation participants our first and second generation, our first and 1.5 generation, because we're thinking about it in terms of immigrants, they made the effort to attend weekly, at least weekly, if not daily. And again, coming to Canada, there were no Jamaat Khanas necessarily set up unless there were Tanzanians here before. And so space rentals, they would have to acquire these space rentals, and purpose-built Jamaat Khanas came a bit later. Okay, so here are some of the findings. I'm just going to move a bit closer. Okay, so the parent, most importantly the mother, must affiliate with a religious tradition. It must be of importance to them, and they have some consistent form of religious expression. That seems obvious, right? You can't transmit something that isn't necessarily there or it's not necessarily expressed. So I talk about religious forms as being attending religious services, prayer, expression of devotion, discussing religion, missionary work, volunteering, living ethically, listening or singing religious music or hymns, lighting incense or candles to set scenes. So things that you do to express your religious identity inside and outside of the home. Another important, social factor is that one needs to be socialized into religion, right? You can't, you may have been able to just expect your child to be religious back home. And I say back home because our participants often refer to Uganda, Kenya, or Tanzania as being back home. So I know Salima is going to talk a little bit more about Homeland in her presentation. But you do have to put effort, and you especially have to put effort if you want to do that in Canada. So setting a solid foundation, giving the individuals the means to engage in both private and communal settings. So that means, one, maybe taking them to religious services so they know how that functions, so they don't feel like an other inside their own religious community. They know, how to pray, why they pray, and to do the various religious rites and practices within the communal settings, but also how to do that independently. So setting a solid foundation is important for religious transmission. 3 is this practice of what I'm calling meaning making. So meaning making with religion relative to modern day life and contemporary social issues and debates, as this appears to help make religion relevant and resilient to scrutiny. We are living in for the most part, a secular country, not always, but sometimes it's, for the most part, it's fairly secular, especially when you compare it to other more religious countries. I define meaning making as a cognitive process of the individual whereby they adopt, harmonize, or reject aspects of their religious identity into their psyches. So this is a cognitive process in relation to in-group and out-group norms. Now, this looks different across generations, where we see the third generation or the second generation if we're thinking about immigrants. So not, I'm kind of switching in between the two because we interviewed 3 generations, grandparent, parent, and child. But in this context, those who are born in Canada, they belong to 2 groups. They belong to perhaps the Ismaili community, and they also belong to the Canadian community. And in this sense, they have to harmonize their identity in a way that makes sense to them, right? So there's a cognitive dissonance that may happen at different, different intervals of their lives to be like, okay, well, what does our religion say about women? What's the women question? What about where do LGBTQ folks fit into our religious identity? Is there space for that? So these become especially important to our third generation, regardless whether they're an immigrant or not. And religion needs to have space for these kind of progressive modern day values to be incorporated into religion. If religion is too absolute, it is too exclusive, you do see a lot of cognitive dissonance, and that could result in one leaving religion. So this is why meaning making is important. How is meaning making done? It's done in various ways, but for the most part, discussing religion with mothers or religious leaders and educators seems to help foster this critical thinking process in the youth and in the adolescent. So this being done at an early age, and we saw this with our survey findings as well, they're more likely to be able to negotiate aspects of their religion, to have some sort of kind of individualized religion for themselves that makes sense with them. And again, conservative and liberal religion, there's different ideas here because in some sense, conservative religion is much more there's a preservation factor in conservative religion. Conservative religions seem to be, 1 minute. Okay, well, I have one more slide left, so I'm pretty good. They're more resilient, conservative religion or conservative congregations are more successful in transmitting their religion across generations, which is kind of contradictory to what I just said. So there's something to be explored here, but sometimes conservative religions, say with our Catholic participants, they actually found that it was, because of its exclusivity, because of its absoluteness, they, the third generations often found not religious or culturally Catholic and more spiritual than religious. So these are things to explore. With liberal religion, if religion is too liberal and the forms are weak, so the practices are weak or maybe not consistent, then it's difficult to pass that on to the next generation. But again, we may be measuring religion wrong, and so this is something that we need to continue, 5 and 10 years down the road. And this is my last slide. Community is very, very important. If you want to preserve religion across generations, then you need to find a sense of belonging within the community in which you belong. So to facilitate an environment where community bonds can be formed, this helps to reinforce immigrant religious identity, belonging, and engagement into adulthood. And again, context matters because people may be, kind of pulled between, it was much easier, your community, you lived amongst your entire community for the most part in East Africa. That is not necessarily the case here. You have different communities that you live amongst here, and those, these subcultures also play in, where you find belonging. So in-group and out-group belonging, this pull between, some of our Ugandan families, there was two out of the four, there was two Ugandan families, and in the, amongst two of the Canadian-born participants, there was a much greater sense of belonging in the Canadian community. There was a desire to belong much more to the Canadian community, and maybe even, they had issues with belonging to the Ismaili community for various, reasons. Maybe they weren't as inclusive, or maybe there weren't as many peers. Maybe they grew up in a smaller town where there weren't as many Ismaili friends to be made. All these things matter. Another thing that has come up in the research is the sense of otherness. Now, otherness can act to, when pull someone or push someone out of community if they don't feel like they belong, but it also can serve as a preservation tool. If you feel that as a Muslim, for example, you are being othered by greater Canadian society, then you will retreat to the in-group. Right? But then in another sense, you may want so much to be a part of the out-group that you downplay your otherness and try very much so to belong into the Canadian society. So this idea of otherness becomes really, really important. And again, how are these, some of the ways in which these community bonds are formed? Religious services, so attending religious services, religious education, youth programming, volunteering, and just kind of creating these sub-societal, groups where, religious identity is preserved because of the groups in which you are a part of. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next we have Salima Versi. Thank you.
Okay. While we're getting my slides up, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am because the context is probably a little bit relevant. So I am still working on a PhD in religious studies at the U of A. I specialize in contemporary Islam and Canadian Ismailism. My master's work looked at the migration from East Africa. And specifically, I looked at the impact of Imamate guidance and Ismaili institutions on the migration. And my current dissertation work looks at the establishment of a Canadian Ismaili identity, particularly for those that are Khoja East African Ismailis in Canada. And so while my master's work looked specifically at the migrating generation, so people who were sort of in their 20s and 30s in the 70s and that sort of heyday of migration from East Africa, my current work looks across generations. And it's been fascinating work. It's all interviews, so it's all kind of qualitative work because what I'm most interested in is what people have to say for themselves. I'm a bad academic. I will do analysis, but I'm much more interested in what people have to say for themselves because in the rest of my life, I'm a psychotherapist. I have a private practice. I specialize in working with predominantly Muslim women and queer folks of color. And so that is also where my heart is. And I think the way that we tell stories about who we are and what we believe in and what matters to us tells us so much. And so that filters into my work as well. And then in the Ismaili community, I'm also an alwaiza, which is a preacher, pastoral caregiver, scholar. And so all of these worlds collide when I get to do this kind of work, and that is wonderful and joyous and fascinating for me, but perhaps confusing for all of you. So I'm giving you a fair warning that it might not sound as academic as maybe we have heard for the rest of the panels today, but I still think it's really interesting stuff. So. What I wanted to start with was a little bit of a story about why this particular presentation occurred to me. And it is basically, sort of midway through the pandemic, I created a Facebook group of basically some of my favorite Ismailis, mostly women and queer folks who lean pretty hard left and were really, really deeply invested in concepts around social justice. And so we go there to talk about things that we don't always get space to talk about in other places. And in one of those conversations, one of the women had shared an article about Khoja Ismaili cuisine. And it hadn't sat well for her. And she sort of had this sense of like, it feels kind of appropriative. Like it feels like we've taken things that are East African that belong to Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda and have made them as though they're ours, but they aren't really. And one of the other girls had responded and said, where do we get to exist then? And the grief of that. And that's a consistent theme in our group is we confront these deep issues around social justice, around anti-Blackness in our community, around gender parity, around the places where there are still sore points for us. But under all of that, there is all this grief. And so part of what I interrogate in my doctoral work is, what does that mean? What is this tension that we carry between longing and belonging? And how does that show up in how we identify ourselves as Canadians, as Ismailis, and as Canadian Ismailis? So that's what I ask in my dissertation work. What does it mean for you to be a Canadian? What does it mean for you to be an Ismaili? And what does it mean for you to be a Canadian Ismaili? I will not cover all those questions today. But what I did want to talk about was how that shows up when I ask people what it means to be Canadian, and how that shifts across generations and across time, and also about how faith mediates that conversation in very particular ways for Canadian Ismailis that I think is very relevant and often missing in our conversations. So I watched Omar's documentary the other day, lovely, wonderful work, but like the lack of conversation around faith was weird for me because I know how much that matters in conversations inside the community. And so part of my work is to pull that stuff into the academic realm. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to do that by sharing 5 quotes. That's all I'm going to do today. They're block quotes, but I'm going to share 5 of them. 2 are from my master's work. So one talks about that initial visa office. Mike Malloy features in the story. It's a lovely story. There is another one that talks about sort of post-migration and how people decided to settle and what that looked like. And then there's two that came from the doctoral work that are younger folks who are queer and non-binary and belong to all these kinds of really interesting groups of people that don't often get a voice in this kind of research, and how they understand their identity as Canadians. And then one other one that's kind of mid-ground, who was born here but was in the early years of the migration, and how he understood kind of this connection between identity and faith. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of a summary at the end. So we're going to try and make it through 5 quotes. I apologize if you cannot read them, but I will read them to you, okay? So this is one of my favorite stories from my master's work. And it was a gentleman that I've known for a very, very long time who told me about his story of applying for coming to Canada. So he says, Britain made it as hard as possible for people to get their claims processed and documents processed. So the British High Commission in Kampala would open at 9 and close at noon and reopen at 1:30 and close at 3:30. Thousands of people lined up. And at about day 45 or so, the US government put a full-page ad in the newspaper saying that they would take so many doctors and so many engineers to go to the US. Also about that time, Canada announced that they were going to take 5,000 people to Canada. So the Canadian High Commission put out an ad in the newspaper saying, we are going to open at 6 a.m. And most of us thought that was a big joke because all the other embassies opened at 9, but since we were accustomed to lining up in the middle of the night, we went and lined up, and sure enough, at about 7 o'clock, they opened the doors. And they didn't close them for lunch. and they didn't close them until they had processed all the people for that day. Not only that, they had kept chairs for us outside to sit on. The day I went for my interview, a battalion of tanks was coming by, and you could see where the Canadian High Commission was located. It was in the IPS building, and all the other embassies were lower down, and you could see all the guards pushing people out of all the embassies. And here were the Canadians saying to everybody, come on in. And Mike Malloy stood in front of this glass panel and said, nobody is going to do anything to you. And one of the battalions pointed its gun at the window, and then, of course, they took off. So thank you. It's an honor to have you in the audience. It's one of my favorite stories. So this story is the story that I tell when people ask me why the generation that migrated has such deep affinity and loyalty to Canada. These are the kinds of stories that the migrating generation will tell about what it is that Canada did for them. And the emotional valence of that, I think, cannot be underestimated, right? Like the impact that that has on people's psyches is so strong. And so, of course, they're gonna have this deep sense of being Canadian and a deep sense of loyalty to that identity in the way that it was presented to them in the moments of migration, right? So it is a very sanitized kind of version of Canadian identity, but there's a reason for that, okay? So part 2 is this quote. It's actually a couple quotes. So this is about the Imam's first visit. So when the Aga Khan came to Canada in 1978, it was the first time he had visited Canada. And in that visit, he said something that ultimately changed the course of Canadian Ismailis entirely. Up until that point, a lot of people thought about going back to East Africa. And when the Imam came, he made a farman, an edict, a declaration to the community that contained guidance, and he said a couple really critical things. So these are the quotes. So prior to the 78 visit, Sir Ibu came twice, and he said, get your chopri, get your passport. But the Imam's first farman I still remember was, I'm happy to see you here. It is the wish of your Imam to make this your home. He said 5 times in the same farman, I repeat, at the end he said, I repeat, this is where your generations should make their home, okay? The second one is, there was a very important farman that Mullah made when he first came in 1978 to Canada, where he said, make Canada your home. For me, that has always stood out in my mind because he was saying to us, don't think about what you had before. So to me, Mullah is saying, you have to take this and move on and not think about what you had in the past. Now you have to think forward. You have to think about family, your parents, your children. To me, that farman really stood out in that he was saying that now you have to build a foundation here, because in East Africa, we had already built that foundation. So to me, he was saying that that same foundation had to be built in Canada in order to move on. Okay, so this is where we start to see that mediating influence of faith. And there's a lot of other stuff that I think makes a difference, but this farman came up in every interview I did for my master's degree. So I did a dozen interviews and it came up every time. And I didn't ask, I just said, tell me about your experience, and it came up without fail, right? So it was such a critical moment, and in that generation, I think we cannot underestimate the impact of faith in terms of how we then think about Canada as home. Okay, when you look at what happens after, so this is a young girl, she grew up in Red Deer, and she talks then about what it's like to be a child of that generation, right? And how you then understand what Canadian identity looks like in that context. So she says, a lot of our families are like, they feel really grateful to be here. They feel really blessed, and I don't think that's untrue. Like, obviously, you know, coming from the circumstances that we came from and where we were, I consider myself extremely lucky to be in the position that I'm in, to know that, you know, nothing that I have done to deserve it, right, necessarily, but I think it can instill something that can make you believe that nothing is wrong and everything is perfect. Canada's the best, the most diverse, it's pluralistic, and there's nothing wrong, and you know, it's just like you're fed the information, and so in that sense, it's Canadian too to hide these kinds of things that are basically heinous. The fact that South Africa is here to learn about how we do apartheid well, you know, that kind of thing is really disturbing. And I sit here and I think about how do I reconcile this with my Canada is the best, the most awesome, and Pierre Trudeau came and welcomed the Ugandan Ismailis from the plane, you know, like that whole myth that we have. It's not a myth, but it is very one-sided. It's slanted, okay? And then she goes on to say, I think my family, like my parents, my grandparents, really feel like they owe Canada a lot. And that's not to say that we don't, but it's just like, it's one of those things, like, yeah, they also benefited from us being here. We own that too. I was born and raised here. I'm a Canadian, and I own all the bad stuff my country does, as like along with all the good stuff. I'm happy to be the one waving the flag. It's a great country, and I'm happy to live here. But I'm also not going to be the one to say that Canada has absolutely no faults and everything is fine, and that we don't need to do anything about, you know, our structural inequalities, racism and sexism and all of those things, because they do exist. Pretending that they don't is not helpful. And I think that the way that they experience these kinds of inequities and whatever is just so different from how I do in some circumstances. For them, it was just self-preservation. They just don't look at it. They pretend that it's not there. It's like, I can't spend so much time thinking about it because it will not take me places and it will keep me from moving forward. And so you hear that echo of the you have to stay here and this is how we move forward, then in the next generation for like, I understand why my parents responded that way, but that's not what Canada is for me, okay? All right, one more, and this one's slightly more, it's interesting. Like, so this is someone who works actively in social justice work, and so the way that they talk about Canadian identity takes on that slant, and I just think it's really fascinating. So this person says, I live on Turtle Island in Canada under, I guess, the control of, and I'm required to abide by the cultural norms that encompass Canadian so-called nationhood, and I don't identify. I identify with the term Canadian in this way in which I reject what the culture or reject what the marker means, but I also have to take ownership or accountability of the way in which I participate in and represent that. So yeah, I'm a Canadian, I was born here, I don't have a lot of patriotism towards Canada or a lot of value. That was something my parents tried to instill, this notion of Canada, that it saved our family and like Trudeau and like we owe our lives to them and therefore we owe our loyalty to them. I also, I guess, I identify as Canadian insofar as it's like the box that I choose to be coded into external people while traveling and yeah, whatever. I'll only be Canadian because they're asking, like the question is asking, is what box do I put you in? That's a simple one and one that I can contend with the consequences of that and that stereotypes that come with that. But I reject that as like an internal coding. Like I don't partake in Canadian pumping up. So when I'm overseas or in unexpected circumstances, the way that I refuse to make that point of camaraderie. Yeah, so how I identify with being Canadian or what it means is like I try to keep it limited to the territory that I occupy and the historical legacy connected and the relationship to the land or the connection to the land that I'm situated in. Totally different thing. Right? And so this is over the span of one generation, how much we've shifted in what does home mean then? Okay, I saw the 1 minute, I see you. I'm gonna make one other point because it's the important one and then I'll stop, I promise. Okay, I'm gonna read you this last quote because I think this is the point that I wanna make about faith, right? That yes, faith was what mediated the identity piece in the previous generation, but it continues to be a mediating piece even in the generations that come after. So this participant was one of the first ones kind of born in Canada. And what he says is that I am an Ismaili first, I think, living in a Canadian context. We've always been told to make Canada your home, and I remember that loud and clear, and even my parents using that, and much more the greater community using that as kind of a reminder not to be nostalgically attached to Uganda and say, but oh, that was so much better, and this and that, and we had all this taken care of, and life was so much easier there. But we've been told, make Canada your home. It's almost like they don't want, whenever there's something negative about the Canadian experience because of their struggle, that's what they want to hold on to, that advice. That's the internal law. Like external law is don't jaywalk and don't speed and make sure you obey the external laws, but the internal law is make Canada your home and say your dua and make sure that you stay true to your faith within the Canadian context. And without that guidance, there would be a lot of energy spent on the nostalgic, how do we get back home where things were better? Or sorry, when things get better. That it was vital for them to break that link and say, we must make the context here our home. But then that means that's like, what's your identity? And my parents went through probably a very different perspective. And for me, it was probably very much because I was born here, but I am in this family environment where it's all about the Ismaili faith and Ismaili principles. Like, yeah, we're in Canada, but we're not like these other people. And that narrative was constantly there. Okay, so the point I wanted to make very quickly, and then we can talk about it in questions, is that what I have discovered in now a decade and a bit of studying this, which is far too long, is that I don't think it's possible to overstate the impact that faith has on identity and values and a sense of belonging for Canadian Ismailis from East Africa. Like, it is a factor in almost everything. And so even when you see someone who's talking about Canada as Turtle Island, Canada as not a thing that I affiliate with in this patriotic sense, it's still rooted in values that they in other places in the interview talk about as deeply Ismaili and deeply Islamic. And so that faith continues to be incredibly relevant in this conversation around how do we define the home in the Make This Your Home, but that understanding shifts over time because the context shifts, because our ability to navigate things with privilege shifts. And so those kinds of like intersections of identity, I think, are so incredibly interesting and tell us about the richness of the way in which we understand who we are and what home means to us. And it also explains that tension that we see in younger generations in terms of, yes, transmission of faith, in terms of belonging, in terms of identity, because they're contending with it in a completely different context. And they have to contend with both the good and the bad of the place that we now call home. So I'm gonna stop there, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'd like to open the floor to questions. And if you have a question for all the speakers to respond to, please ask so. If you have a specific question for a specific speaker, also let us know. That would be very helpful, and then I can direct the questions. But I'm open to questions from the floor. Does anybody have and please come to the mic. Yes, do so. Thank you.
Thank you for these amazing presentations. My question is for, is it Selma? Sorry,
Salima.
Salima, sorry, Salima. I loved your comparison of the different generational responses. And just not being a Ismaili myself, can you just speak to the degree to which this idea of make Canada your home also included a degree of public engagement with public life in Canada?
Yeah,
because I think the Ismaili community has been remarkably present at the political level.
Yeah, so I assume my mic is on, yes. Okay, so my master's dissertation looked at the impact specifically of imamate guidance and imamate institutions on the migration process. And as I said, that firman came up in every interview. And it had this like deep psychological impact on everybody that I spoke to, but how they interpreted home varied significantly too. And so for some people, that meant citizenship. It meant a passport. For some people, it meant buying a house and making sure that you had something solid here. For some people, it meant civic engagement, right? Like, how do you join committees? How do you serve the community? How do you do this larger kind of work? And for some people, it was about family and values and all of those kinds of things, right? And so it was all of those things. What I'm seeing then in the current dissertation work is how that has come to fruition in the generations that have come after. And so it's all of those things, actually, for the generations that have come after. And that has been reinforced, I think, again, by continued guidance from the imam, which talks about civil society, which talks about the importance of like committing to your community. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting when we look at the Ugandan case as sort of a starting point is that when Uganda became a national state in its own right, the guidance from the imam was to become a Ugandan citizen. it was to surrender your British passport and to become a citizen of the new states, and that you should commit yourself to the new territories. And that was true for Uganda, but it was true for a lot of other countries as well that were nationalizing. And so that guidance has remained consistent in the sense that that also applied in Canada, that you should still consistently commit to this country and to giving this country everything that you have, that is part of what we give back. And so that's become, as we heard, I think, in earlier panels, part of the narrative that internally and Ismailis will tell, and the image that they project outward. So if you look at official Ismaili websites and that kind of stuff around the commemoration, you're seeing things like Civic, which is sort of like this national endeavor to commit like thousands of hours of volunteer time to Canadian communities, basically, right? And so, yeah, that is, as far as I'm concerned, deeply mediated by faith, because that is still in line with guidance that has been given by the Imam. And the word that's used in the Ismaili community is seva, which is from a Sanskrit word, but this idea, or khidmad, which is the Arabic Persian word, but service. And that you serve Allah, you serve the imamate, you serve your community by serving everybody. And so that is a foundational piece across the board. And we see that show up in how Ismailis then show up publicly. So yeah, absolutely, I think the research shows that too.
Yeah, I'm going to ask, I just wanted to just try to tie a couple things up, because I had the same question, but it was interesting in your quotation that the person said, make your home, forget your past. That was an interesting tension. I won't ask you to do that because there are other questions, but it's something that we come to.
We can chat.
And it comes back to what Karim said in the morning. Does making your home mean forgetting your past? I don't think that those things are...
Can I give a quick psych answer?
Sure.
It'll be really quick. So in my psych work, one of the things that I work on a lot is residual trauma. And so one of the things that happens when we rewrite our histories and sanitize them is that there's no longer space for grief. And that too comes up in the research, but it comes up also in my work in psychology and in my practice and in the Jamaat when I'm there and talking to people, that there is this underlying grief that hasn't been expressed because we've been so forward focused for so long. And so as I've been prepping for this, one of the things that I think about often, and even as we were preparing for the Imam's Diamond Jubilee a few years ago, was how do we hold space for the grief and for the trauma and make room for those things as part of our narrative. And part of me thinks that that is the work of the new generation, like the younger generations too, that we have the privilege to hold that space, and so we can.
Okay, I'm going to move
Yes,
to the
sorry,
next
go
question.
ahead.
Yeah.
I'll try and be as brief as possible. In the context of Uganda, when the Imam said, make Canada your home, there was no going back.
Yeah.
That's what he meant. And prior to that, Prince Saduddin Aga Khan visited Canada for the first member of the Aga Khan family in 1974. And he spoke in the context as the High Commissioner for Refugees. He said, I don't want you to become like a group of gypsies moving from country to country to country. Take the example of the Jewish communities and the Chinese communities in America. They maintain their distinctive identity, but they're part of the bigger country. And His Highness, wherever he's been, he said, your first loyalty is to the country that affords you your protection.
Yeah.
And I was at His Highness's Diamond Jubilee dinner, which was hosted by the Governor General, and there were 3 prime ministers present.
I am going to move you along because there are like 5 questions,
sorry, I'll
so
be
I
very
really
quick.
do need you to ask the question.
So
Sorry.
the question was, Ismaili values and Canadian values are in sync.
Okay, so this is the core.
So I'm going to just ask her a couple more questions
absolutely.
because otherwise
Sorry,
we'll
go
end up
ahead.
back and forth. Sorry, Salima,
No,
I
that's good.
apologize,
Go
but I
ahead.
just wanted to ask. Please, can you bring it to the mic because I think you recorded. Sorry, Jason, could you come to the microphone? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first is to Omme-Salma, and the second to Salima. I was a little disturbed when you suggested that the young man said he's not African, he's not Indian, and that you saw as an erasure. I would see this as being post-racial. I am where I am. Yeah. So, for example, in my case, I'm Goan, and I identify as Goan and South Asian, but I will not identify as Indian, even though I hold an Indian passport, because of the kind of complex relationship that India has with Goa, right? So I think very often we can get trapped within a racial framing if we're not too careful with it. I'm trying to carry on the conversation I began yesterday with talking about post-national or critiquing the national frameworks that we work in. That was point one. Point two, Salima, and my question to you actually became a little more richer after your intervention. There's something very similar about Catholics and Ismailis,
Yes.
in that both the heads of these communities, these are not national communities. They are transnational. They're imperial formations, right? They both say that you need to work with the nation, while perhaps at the same time not identifying completely with the nation. But I think both these formations need to rethink the way in which they engage with the nation, because too far they've been trapped within the national, right? And I think some of the where am I at home? Once again, this is the Goan in me speaking. You are at home where you are. I mean, it's really complex, but we need to start thinking outside, or consciously thinking outside of national frameworks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to take a few more questions, please. Yes, over here. Would you mind coming to the microphone? Thank you so much. And you're collecting these questions both. Yeah. Okay, terrific.
Yes, my question is for, sorry, I don't remember your name. Richard. The South Sudanese people that you mentioned very briefly about, is it 25,000 plus people in 2004 or since 2004? And are there any similarities between their situation and the situation that the Ugandan refugees were in terms of being accepted?
Okay, terrific. I'm just going to start from the panelists who haven't spoken first, and then I'll go to Salima.
no, that's
Okay, it's all right. Omme, please, yes, to respond to the question.
Sure, thank you for your question. And I mean, I'm speaking like I'm an American. In the American context, I've been there 5 years. But I think we all know the context of the post-racial Obama America, right? That is an erasure of race. That is, and I don't know if you meant that as like I don't know how you were using post-racial, but that the definition is the erasure of race, like discursively, but I think also very actively in everyday life, right? I don't see race, I'm colorblind. Those are post-racial words that erase race from a world, from a country that is built on racism and genocide and slavery, and so I see that as different from the comment of I am where I am. That I really get. And I think that that's what that interview definitely was saying, right? He's like, I'm an American, right? And so I don't see that as post-racial. I see that very much as what you were alluding to before, as the boundaries of a nation. He has no affinity to the nation of Uganda and to the nation of India. And I wonder, as second generation, I was born in Dar, but, I grew up here in Toronto. There is this hesitancy to say I'm Indian, but what I mean is racially I'm Indian. And I think in Canada we can say, we have that, word South Asian to be able to express that kind of racial identity, and not, I don't want in any way to tie myself to the Indian nation, especially with all the anti-Muslim rhetoric right now in the Modi government. Like, I don't want in any way to say that I'm Indian. So I think what he was saying was more of a national identity and kind of erasing that in the ways that it aligns with race in America as a melting pot. Like we have the. So I think that it definitely you're right. It is post-racial, which is an erasure of race. Makes sense, I hope.
Thank you.
So I'll kind of answer both simultaneously. So the first part was about this working with the nation and this idea of like how we contribute and like the boundaries of statehood and stuff. And so one of the things that I think is really fascinating about Ismailis is that we have a constitution, which I think is fascinating for so many reasons. But one of the things that the Constitution does actually is make clear that your national loyalty is to the country that you live in, but that also there is this transnational kind of narrative around the imamate, and like that is where you get your values from, and that there is a system of institutions that exist transnationally to support that as well. And so there is this kind of back and forth dynamic between nationhood in the sense of like a modern nation state that you pledge loyalty to through passports and citizenship and all sorts of things, and this broader identity that overarches that is your Ismaili identity. And watching people navigate that in real time as Ismailis is fascinating stuff, because you will get folks like, you can go to any country and still feel like you have a community, and people will talk about that, and people will talk about their commitment to the land that they live in, but also this broader kind of humanist perspective. And His Highness actually locates that within a conversation around things like cosmopolitan ethics, right? And how do we kind of take on this ethical norm that encompasses a broader sense of humanity and that allows us to contribute to like the world as a whole, right? And so I think those things exist together, and not necessarily in tension, but certainly I think sometimes there's a bit of push and pull there. But the Imam at least is very clear that there is your national loyalty, and then there is who you are as an Ismaili. And ideally those things work in sync. So to your question about values, I went into my dissertation project assuming that overlap of Canadian values and Ismaili values would be what I would see in every interview. And I saw it in some, right, where people said, I mean, Canadian Ismailis and Ismaili values, they overlap, and so there's a hybridity, almost like a hyphenation, which is what I thought was gonna happen. But then I got a bunch of responses that were like the one that I read at the end, which is like, actually, my values are Ismaili. And they just happen to work well in this context because Canadians also share those values. But my values, that core thing, that's an Ismaili thing. And I find that fascinating because I expected to see hybridity, and I didn't in all cases. And even in younger folks, that I saw that Ismaili thing as being the core identity and the Canadian thing as being the soil in which that's planted. And I'm still like teasing that apart to see what that looks like and what that means, but it wasn't necessarily what I expected. So yeah.
Okay, I think we have we are almost at time, but I just wanted to double check to see if there's any burning question from the audience. I also wanted to mention, I will cut to you in a minute. If you wouldn't mind going to the mic, please. Mention that the lecture by Mr. Mamdani, Dr. Mamdani, will be recorded, I think, is that? Everything is recorded, and that unfortunately, because of technical issues, we weren't able to engage with him in question and answer, but he's fully aware that we were here and that we were engaged in the conversation, and that his lecture, and that we can, at some point, perhaps, if people have questions for him, I encourage you to maybe write them down, and we can pass them on to him in some way, shape, or form. We are in correspondence with him, and maybe Shazan can speak to that more at the end as to how that mechanics will work. I'm just going to take this final question, and then you can maybe come back, and that would be helpful. Thanks, Shazan. Thanks.
Hi, it's Merv.
There's another question here. I'll take these two questions. Okay, please go ahead.
It's Merv Mascarenhas again. I'm one of the few people in this room who's not Ismaili. And the burning question is, how many Canadians, how many Ugandans would Canada have taken if the Aga Khan was not there or hadn't intervened? Did we ride on the coattails of the Ismailis and the Aga Khan?
I think there's only one person in this room who can answer that question, and that's Mr. Beloy here.
That's out of my pay grade. I'm not even going to touch it.
And if you want to answer from where you're sitting, you're welcome to. Yeah. But you're welcome also to bring the mic.
You can take this one.
I was going to do a commercial anyway. Over on the table, there's a little pile of gray cards, gray postcards. And if you go to the site there, you'll get, I think it's a 12-year scan of statistics of people leaving East Africa between 66 and 78. So the first time those numbers have ever come up, we had them pulled by immigration about 2 months ago. Very cool. Interesting, and it shows that between 66, which is the year before the point system came in, and 71, about 3,500 people came to Canada, including about 700 that were pushed out of Kenya at a certain point late in that. From 72 to 78, 28,000. So 3,500, 28,000. What was being said various times today about the push, the unsettling effect, is really reflects in those numbers. And the numbers are very hard because we used something called the country of last permanent residence rather than citizenship, which caught the stateless, the Indians that we scooped up on the other. The interesting question is the impact of the Aga Khan. Now let me make one thing very clear. As a Canadian visa officer serving at that time, in that context, if we had been told you will take Ismailis, we'd have downed tools and walked away. We just came out of 100 years of race-based, national-based immigration, and we weren't going back there. And we got a lot of pushing from a lot of famous people in that direction, but we held our ground. And but on the other hand, so what were the criteria we used? Well, one was the point system because that's all we had. But the crux of that was to focus on people with nowhere else to go. And the Goans and the Ismailis, because they'd taken out citizenship, fell into our arms. Now those decisions were made up to the 13th of September. His Highness came to Canada on the 28th of September. Did he and Trudeau have telephone conversations? God only knows. Well, His Highness knows. Trudeau's not answering. But I think, I mean, the British closed up shop 10 or 12 days before we did because they ran out of cases. And they told us, you took the cream. Well, if you look at how the Hindus and Sikhs have done in the UK, it was all cream. It was just that we were not, you know, we got through the point system, and we still had lots of room. And so that's how we saw it. We'll only, maybe the Trudeau papers, if they're ever opened up, will give us some clues to that. But unless there were secret conversations over the phone, they didn't talk until the 28th. Well, he actually came to Canada. And the great story there is he goes for lunch.
The hockey.
And the great games going on. And so the Canadians are paying tremendous attention to His Highness, of course, but also they're getting signals from the kitchen about what the score is. And at one point, His Highness, Trudeau had ruled that we're not, there was no mention of a total. Whatever we were able to shove on the planes was going to be the total. But the theory is that at one point, the score is 3-3, and somehow that is signaled to the Canadian host, and the Canadian host puts 6 fingers on the table just as His Highness asks how many are going, and he looks at the 6 fingers and he says, 6,000. That's pretty good. So
That's a good number.
That's a legend, but it might be true.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask the question.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Can you please, thank you very much.
My question is for Alyshea. I've heard, and I'm wondering if you can say if this is true or not, that after immigrants arrive in a country like Canada, it takes 3 generations for that immigrant identity to get lost. I'm wondering if that's true from your research, and when you look at those generational impacts, and particularly you mentioned people going from a religious identity to a spiritual identity, what impact that has on community building.
Right.
Thanks.
Well, I can say that it doesn't, when we think of what, in the case of the Ismailis, and what that immigrant Ismaili identity looks like, it doesn't look like it's fully getting lost because the values are still theirs, and they speak about these values, but they say that maybe to my mom or my dad, these are Ismaili values, but to me, these are just, Canadian values. So I don't necessarily see an entire loss what we think of when we think of identity. Now, again, race, ethnicity, and culture all play into the preservation of immigrant identity. And again, I would make the case that the more one is accepted into mainstream society, that definitely has an effect on, religion in particular, but not necessarily culture, right? And when we think of culture, it could be food, it could be language, it could be a bunch of different things. But when it comes to religion, when we look at the recent Stats Canada, we do see that Christian religions, for the most part, are declining over time. The non-religious group is getting larger and larger. Immigrant identities are still thriving. They are still growing. But of course, you see the outliers leaving faith communities and I would say fully assimilating into Canadian secular society. Yeah.
Okay. On that note of Canadian secular society, I will pull my secular privilege here as chair. Maybe it's a religious privilege. I don't know. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining this afternoon.